She saved a millionaire's life and vanished. Years later, the truth shocked the world. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Rain pounded against the windows of Dean's Diner, transforming the New York City streets into a blur of neon reflections and shadowy figures hurrying past. Charlotte Evans wiped down the counter for the 100th time that evening, her movements mechanical after 8 hours on her feet. The clock above the kitchen door showed 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes until her shift ended. The diner was nearly empty, save for 3 regulars, an elderly couple sharing a slice of apple pie, and a well-dressed man in the corner booth who had barely touched his coffee. Something about him had caught Charlotte's attention when he'd walked in an hour ago. Despite his expensive suit and carefully composed demeanor, his eyes held a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical exhaustion. Charlotte knew that look. She saw it in her own reflection more often than she cared to admit. "You heading home soon, honey?" Ruby, the night cook, called from the kitchen. "Storm's getting worse." "Just a few more minutes," Charlotte replied, her gaze drifting back to the man in the corner. He had been staring at his laptop screen, but now his hand trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. Something wasn't right. The cup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor. Charlotte started forward, but before she could reach him, the man slumped sideways in his booth, his face ashen. Time seemed to slow down. Charlotte's feet carried her forward even as her mind screamed at her to stay back, to call someone else, to remain uninvolved. She'd learned the hard way that getting involved only led to trouble. But her body moved of its own accord, guided by an instinct she couldn't suppress. "Sir, can you hear me?" She touched his shoulder, then checked his pulse. Nothing. His skin was clammy, his lips taking on a bluish tinge. "Ruby! Call 911, Charlotte shouted, already lowering the man to the floor. Her hands shook as she loosened his tie and began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. She counted under her breath, trying to remember her first aid training from years ago. The elderly couple had rushed over, the woman clutching her husband's arm as they watched. "Is he?" "Keep counting," Charlotte muttered to herself, blocking out everything else. 30 compressions. 2 rescue breaths. Again and again. Her arms ached, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. After what felt like hours but must have been only minutes, the man gasped. Color slowly returned to his face as he took shallow breaths. In the distance, sirens wailed. Charlotte sat back on her heels, her own heart pounding. The man's eyes fluttered open, confused and unfocused. "What? Don't try to move," she said softly. "Help is coming." His hand found hers, gripping it weakly. "Thank you," he whispered. The paramedics burst through the door, bringing with them the smell of rain and urgency. Charlotte stepped back, letting them take over. As they worked, she noticed the man's laptop and briefcase still in the booth. The screen showed an email signature. Oliver Bennett, CEO of Bennett Technologies. Her stomach dropped. Everyone in New York knew that name. The mysterious tech mogul whose innovations had revolutionized artificial intelligence. The billionaire who rarely appeared in public, but whose influence touched countless lives. The paramedics were preparing to transport him now. One of them turned to Charlotte. "We'll need your statement for the report, miss. Charlotte glanced at Oliver Bennett, now conscious but groggy on the stretcher. In that moment, all her carefully constructed walls screamed in warning. She'd spent years keeping her head down, staying invisible, protecting herself from the complications that came with being noticed. "I just did what anyone would do," she said, backing away. I have to go." Before anyone could stop her, Charlotte grabbed her coat from behind the counter and slipped out the back door into the rain. The cold drops mixed with the tears she hadn't realized were falling. As she hurried through the dark streets, Charlotte told herself she'd done the right thing by leaving. Getting involved with someone like Oliver Bennett could only lead to questions. Questions about her past, about the night 5 years ago that had sent her running from her old life. Questions she could never answer. But even as she pulled her coat tighter against the rain, a small voice in her head wondered if she'd just made another mistake by running away. If perhaps, this time, things could have been different. The storm followed her home, its rhythm matching the troubled beating of her heart. In her tiny apartment, Charlotte peeled off her wet clothes and tried to stop her hands from shaking. Tomorrow, she decided, she would ask Ruby for a transfer to another diner location, just to be safe, just to stay invisible. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that her simple act of courage that night had set in motion events that would eventually force her to confront everything she'd been running from. The night that was supposed to be just another shift at a forgotten diner would become the first chapter of a story she never expected to tell. Oliver Bennett stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching dawn break over Manhattan. 3 days had passed since his heart attack at Dean's Diner, and the city below seemed different somehow, sharper, more vivid, as if his brush with death had adjusted the contrast of the world. His fingers absently traced the spot where the defibrillator pads had left faint marks on his chest. The doctors had been clear, without immediate CPR, he wouldn't have survived those crucial minutes before the ambulance arrived. He owed his life to a woman who had vanished like morning mist. Mr. Bennett, his assistant, Regina Walsh, appeared in the doorway. "The private investigator is here." Oliver nodded, turning away from the window. "Send him in." David Chen entered with quiet confidence, his weathered face suggesting years of experience. He carried a thin folder and a cup of coffee that Oliver suspected wasn't his first of the day. "Tell me what you have," Oliver said, settling behind his desk. Chen opened the folder. The diner's security cameras were down for maintenance that night. Convenient timing. He laid out several photographs. "These are from street cameras in the area. The quality isn't great due to the rain, but we can see someone leaving through the back door at 11:58 p.m. Oliver leaned forward, studying the grainy image of a woman hurrying through the rain. Her face was obscured, turned away from the camera as if she'd known it was there. All he could make out was her slight frame and dark hair pulled back in a practical style. "The diner's owner claims she was a newer hire," Chen continued. "Worked there about 3 months. Gave her notice the next morning by phone. The name on her employment papers was Charlotte Evans. But," he hesitated, "but the social security number doesn't match any Charlotte Evans in the system. The address she listed belongs to an abandoned building in Queens. She's either very careful or very practiced at disappearing." Oliver wasn't surprised. He'd sensed something in those few moments of consciousness, a guardedness in her voice, a tension in her movements that spoke of someone accustomed to staying in the shadows. "What about the other employees?" "The cook, Ruby Martinez, seems genuinely confused. Says Charlotte was quiet, reliable, kept to herself. Always picked up extra shifts, but never joined the staff for drinks after work. The only personal detail Ruby remembers is that Charlotte once mentioned living in Boston before New York." Oliver stood, walking back to the window. Below, the city was fully awake now, streams of people flowing through the streets like blood through veins. Somewhere out there was the woman who had kept those veins pumping in his own body. "Mr. Bennett," Chen said carefully, "finding someone who doesn't want to be found. It can take time, and there's no guarantee." "Money isn't an issue," Oliver interrupted. "Whatever resources you need, they're yours. Just find her." After Chen left, Oliver sank into his chair, feeling the weight of his 63 years. His hand drifted to the small drawer in his desk, pulling out a worn photograph, himself at 30, standing beside his late wife, Catherine. She'd been gone 15 years now, but he could still hear her voice telling him he worked too hard, lived too little. "You'd know what to do, wouldn't you, Kate?" he murmured. She had always been better at connecting with people, at seeing past their defenses to the truth underneath. His computer chimed with a calendar reminder. Board meeting, annual charity initiative review. Oliver straightened his tie, pushing thoughts of the mysterious Charlotte aside. He had an empire to run, after all, but as he gathered his papers, An idea began to form. If he couldn't find one woman in a city of millions, perhaps he could cast a wider net, create something that might draw her out, or at the very least, honor what she'd done for him. "Regina," he called, pressing the intercom, "cancel my afternoon appointments and get me everything you can find about organizations that help people start over, new identities, fresh starts, that sort of thing." "Are you sure, sir?" "The board won't be happy about... The board will understand when I explain my new vision for the Bennett Foundation." He picked up Catherine's photo again, remembering how she'd always said that every act of kindness created ripples that touched countless lives. "Sometimes, Regina, it takes nearly dying to remember how to live." The morning sun caught the frame of Catherine's photo, casting a warm glow across his desk. Outside his window, a gentle rain began to fall, so different from the storm that had changed everything, yet somehow carrying the same promise of renewal. Oliver Bennett had built his fortune by seeing patterns where others saw chaos. Now, he would use those same skills to find the woman who had given him a second chance, and perhaps, in the process, he would finally honor Catherine's last wish, that he learn to open his heart again before it was too late. The woman, who now called herself Charlotte Reed, walked through Chicago's Humboldt Park neighborhood, her boots crunching through early autumn leaves. 3 years had passed since that rainy night in New York, but some habits died hard, like checking her reflection in store windows to ensure no one was following her, or scanning each room for exits before settling in. Today's destination was the Harmony House Women's Shelter, where she'd worked as a counselor for the past 18 months. The brick building looked unremarkable from the outside, which was exactly the point. Safety often meant invisibility. Charlotte understood that better than most. "There you are," Lydia Harper's voice greeted her as she entered. Her colleague and closest friend, though Charlotte still struggled with that word, was juggling a stack of files and 2 cups of coffee. Ready for the morning intake. Charlotte took one of the coffees, breathing in its warmth. How many new arrivals? 3 overnight, including one who reminds me a lot of you when you first started volunteering here. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Mysterious past. Trust issues. Terrible taste in coffee? All of the above. Lydia's smile faded slightly. She won't give her real name. Keeps looking at the door like she might bolt. Sound familiar? Charlotte remembered her own first days in Chicago, when she'd wandered into Harmony House looking to make a donation from her waitressing tips. Something about the place, the quiet strength of the women there, the absence of judgment, had drawn her back. Volunteering had led to a part-time position, then full-time work, once she'd earned her counseling certification. Where is she now? Room 12. Her name, or at least what she's calling herself, is Rose. Charlotte nodded, already moving toward the residential wing. These early morning conversations were often the most crucial, when the night's fears still felt raw and real. Room 12's door was ajar. Inside, a young woman sat on the edge of the bed, her dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "Good morning," Charlotte said softly, keeping her distance. "I brought coffee, if you'd like some." The woman, Rose, looked up briefly. A fading bruise shadowed her left cheekbone. "I'm not staying," she said. I needed one night." "One night is fine." Charlotte settled into the room's single chair. "No one here will force you to stay or to talk, or even to drink this mediocre coffee." A ghost of a smile touched Rose's lips. "Is it really that bad?" "Terrible. But it's hot, and sometimes that's enough." Rose accepted the cup, her hands shaking slightly. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the morning sun casting long shadows through the window. How did you know?" Rose finally asked. "Know what? To give me space. Everyone else who's come in has tried to make me talk, make me plan, make me—" She trailed off, taking a shaky breath. Charlotte studied her own coffee cup. "Because 11 years ago, I was sitting where you are, different city, different name, same look in my eyes." She rarely shared this much, but something about Rose's vulnerability called to her. "Someone gave me space then, taught me that healing isn't linear, that some days surviving is enough. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Does it get easier? Yes, Charlotte said. And no. You build a new life, piece by piece, find work that matters, make a few careful friends, learn to sleep through the night most times. But the past, she paused, remembering the sound of rain on New York streets, the weight of secrets she still carried. The past doesn't disappear. You just learn to carry it differently. A knock at the door made them both start. Lydia stood in the doorway, apology in her eyes. Charlotte, there's a news report you should see. Something in Lydia's tone made Charlotte's pulse quicken. She excused herself and followed her friend to the staff room, where the morning news played on a small TV. Bennett Foundation's latest initiative, the reporter was saying. In an unprecedented move, tech billionaire Oliver Bennett has announced a $100 million program to help individuals seeking to rebuild their lives after trauma or abuse. When asked about his inspiration, Bennett referenced his own brush with death 3 years ago. The image shifted to Oliver Bennett himself, older than Charlotte remembered, but with the same intensity in his eyes. Everyone deserves a second chance, he was saying. Ooh, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to step in to help without asking for recognition or reward. Charlotte's coffee cup slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the floor. The sound echoed like breaking glass from another life, another city, another name she'd left behind. Charlotte, Lydia's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, she managed, but her voice betrayed her. Because in a way, she had seen a ghost, the ghost of a rain-soaked night she'd tried so hard to forget, of a simple act of kindness that now threatened to unravel everything she'd built. In room 12, Rose was probably still sitting with her cooling coffee, wondering if she dared to hope for a fresh start. Charlotte envied her then, envied the simplicity of her fear, the straightforward nature of her running. Because Charlotte knew firsthand that the most dangerous ghosts weren't the ones you ran from, but the ones you created with your own good intentions. And somewhere in New York, Oliver Bennett was unknowingly hunting for a woman who no longer existed, while the person she'd become watched her carefully constructed world begin to tremble at its foundations. The Bennett Foundation's new headquarters buzzed with activity as Oliver walked through the open-plan office. What had started as a simple idea 3 years ago had grown into something far beyond his initial vision. Screens on the walls displayed real-time updates from their nationwide network of shelters, counseling centers, and job training programs. Your 10 a.m. is waiting in the conference room, Regina said, falling into step beside him. The Chicago delegation. Oliver nodded, adjusting his tie. These meetings had become the highlight of his weeks, connecting with the people who turned his resources into real change. Yet each new city, each new partnership carried a whisper of hope that somehow, somewhere, he might find her. The conference room held 3 women, all rising as he entered. He recognized Patricia Chen, director of Illinois operations, but the other 2 were new faces. Mr. Bennett, Patricia began, I'd like you to meet Lydia Harper and Diana Wilson from Harmony House. They're doing incredible work with trauma survivors in Chicago's West Side. Oliver shook their hands, noticing how Lydia's grip was particularly firm, her gaze direct and evaluating. She reminded him of Catherine somehow, the same unflinching commitment to her cause. Tell me about Harmony House, he said, settling into a chair. Lydia leaned forward. We started small, just a few rooms, and a lot of hope. Now we offer emergency shelter, counseling, job training, legal aid. But what makes us different is our long-term support network. We don't just help women escape dangerous situations. We help them build entirely new lives. Something in her words resonated with Oliver. New identities. Sometimes, yes. Lydia exchanged a glance with Diana. And many of our clients need to completely disconnect from their past lives. It's not just about physical safety. It's about the chance to reinvent themselves. Oliver's pulse quickened. Over the years, he'd learned to recognize these moments when the universe seemed to offer a breadcrumb, How do you identify potential clients? Word of mouth, mostly. Women who've been through our program refer others. We have a network of volunteers who... A knock interrupted them. Regina stood in the doorway, tablet in hand. I'm sorry, Mr. Bennett, but there's a situation that needs your immediate attention. The London office. Oliver raised a hand to pause her. Give me 5 minutes. He turned back to Lydia. You mentioned volunteers. What's your screening process? Thorough background checks, obviously. Though, Lydia hesitated. Some of our best counselors are former clients. They understand the journey in a way others can't. Take Charlotte, for instance. She's become invaluable to our trauma counseling program. Charlotte? The name sent a jolt through Oliver's spine. One of our senior counselors. She has this way of connecting with clients who've completely shut down. It's like she speaks their language. Oliver forced his voice to remain casual. I'd love to meet her sometime. Perhaps when I visit Chicago next month for the regional conference. She's not great with publicity, Lydia said carefully. Prefers to work behind the scenes, but I'll ask her. Regina cleared her throat pointedly from the doorway. Oliver stood, struggling to maintain his professional demeanor. Thank you for coming. Regina will discuss the details of our partnership package. And Ms. Harper, please do encourage your colleague to attend the conference. Sometimes the quietest voices have the most important things to say. In his private office afterward, Oliver paced like a caged lion. Regina, get me everything you can on Harmony House's staff, particularly their counselors. Sir, Regina's tone held a note of concern. Are you thinking... I don't know what I'm thinking. He stopped at the window, watching clouds gather over Manhattan. But 3 years ago, a woman saved my life and vanished. Now we find a shelter counselor named Charlotte who's good with traumatized clients and avoids publicity. It could be coincidence. When Catherine was alive, she always said there's no such thing as coincidence. Only patterns we're not yet wise enough to recognize. He turned to face his assistant. The Chicago conference is in 3 weeks. Move heaven and earth if you have to, but make sure Harmony House has a prominent role. And Regina. Let's keep this between us for now. After Regina left, Oliver opened his laptop, pulling up the Foundation's database of success stories. Hundreds of photographs filled the screen, people whose lives had been transformed by second chances. He'd looked at these faces countless times, always wondering if she might be among them. A new email notification popped up, the preliminary guest list for the Chicago conference. Oliver scrolled through it quickly, his heart nearly stopping when he reached the Harmony House delegation. Charlotte Reed, Trauma Counseling Director. The name was different, but something deep in his gut told him this was no coincidence. He clicked on the attached photo and found himself staring at an empty profile image, just a grey silhouette where a face should be. Still avoiding cameras, he murmured, a smile tugging at his lips. Some things don't change. Thunder rumbled outside, and Oliver glanced up to see rain beginning to fall. Another storm, like the one that had brought them together years ago. But this time, he was ready. This time, she wouldn't disappear into the darkness. He opened his calendar and began to plan, knowing that the next few weeks would require the perfect balance of patience and strategy. Because somewhere in Chicago, a woman who had once saved his life was about to discover that while you can run from your past, you can't always hide from your future, especially when that future has spent 3 years preparing to find you. Charlotte stared at the email in her inbox, her cursor hovering over the conference invitation. The Bennett Foundation Regional Conference required attendance for all senior staff members. Her throat felt tight, as if the walls of her small office at Harmony House were slowly closing in. "You're overthinking this," Lydia said from the doorway, making Charlotte jump. "It's just a conference." Charlotte minimized the email. "You know it's not that simple." "Actually, I don't." Lydia closed the door and sat down. "Because in the 2 years I've known you, you've never explained why the mere mention of Oliver Bennett makes you look like you've seen a ghost." Through the window, Charlotte watched a group of women in the shelter's garden, tending to the fall vegetables. Rose was among them, looking stronger after 2 weeks at Harmony House. She'd started using her real name yesterday, Amanda. Each small step toward trust felt like a victory. What if I told you, Charlotte said slowly, that I met Oliver Bennett once, that I did something that connected us in a way I never intended? Lydia leaned forward. I'd say that explains why you nearly fainted when you saw him on TV last week. It's complicated. With you, it always is. Lydia's voice softened. But Charlotte, or whatever your real name is, you've built something meaningful here. The Foundation's support could help us reach so many more women. Are you really willing to sacrifice that because of something that happened in your past? The question hit home, making Charlotte's chest ache. On her desk, a framed photo showed a group of shelter residents at last year's graduation ceremony, their faces bright with hope. She'd helped them find that hope, showing them that the past didn't have to define their future. There was a night, Charlotte finally said, when I could have walked away. Someone needed help, and every instinct told me to keep my head down, stay invisible, but I didn't. I helped, and then I ran, because that's what I do. What I've always done. Because of what happened in Boston. Charlotte's head snapped up. What do you know about Boston? Nothing, really. You mentioned it once, late night, after that difficult case with the teenage runaway. Lydia's eyes were gentle. You said something about understanding what it's like to defend yourself and have no one believe you. The memory flooded back, unwanted, unstoppable. Rain-slicked streets in Boston. A hand grabbing her arm, the glint of a knife, the sickening thud of a body hitting pavement, police lights painting the wet streets red and blue, while a detective looked at her with eyes that said he'd already decided her guilt. And the thing about running, Charlotte whispered, is that you can convince yourself you're protecting others by staying away. But sometimes you're just protecting yourself from having to trust again. Her computer chimed. Another email about the conference. This one included a personal note. Mr. Bennett specifically requests your attendance at the opening ceremony. He's looking for me, Charlotte realized aloud. And do all of this, the foundation, the shelter network, it's been about finding me. Would that be so terrible? Lydia asked. From what I've seen, Oliver Bennett has spent 3 years building something extraordinary. Something that's helped hundreds of women like Amanda start over, all because he's searching for someone who helped him once. Charlotte stood, needing to move. The walls felt closer than ever. You don't understand. If he finds me, if this comes out, there'll be questions. About that night, about why I ran, about Boston. The press will dig everything up, and all the women who've trusted me, who've shared their stories because they thought I understood. Maybe they'll understand even more, Lydia suggested quietly. Maybe seeing you face your past will show them they can face theirs too. Charlotte's hand drifted to her neck, where a small scar remained from that night in Boston, a reminder of how quickly trust could turn to terror. But there was another mark she carried, invisible but just as permanent. The memory of Oliver Bennett's hand gripping hers as he whispered, "Thank you," in that dim diner. Her computer chimed again. This time, it was a message from Amanda. Can we talk? I'm ready to file the police report. The irony wasn't lost on Charlotte. Here was a woman finding the courage to face her past, while Charlotte still ran from hers. She thought of all the times she'd told her clients that strength wasn't about being fearless. It was about being terrified and moving forward anyway. The conference is in 2 weeks. Lydia said, standing to leave. You don't have to decide right now. But Charlotte, sometimes the walls we think are closing in are actually just the boundaries of our comfort zone, asking us if we're ready to push them back. After Lydia left, Charlotte opened her bottom drawer, pulling out an old newspaper clipping she'd saved despite her better judgment. The headline read, "Tech Mogul's Mysterious Savior. Bennett offers reward for information." She traced his face in the photo, remembering how different he'd looked unconscious on the diner floor, vulnerable, human. Just a man whose life hung in the balance, asking the universe for a second chance. Maybe it was time to give herself one too. Charlotte opened her email and began to type, "Dear Mr. Bennett, I will attend the conference opening ceremony." Her finger hovered over the send button as thunder rolled in the distance. Another storm approaching Chicago, like an echo of that night in New York. This time, she didn't hit send, not yet, but she didn't delete the draft either, and somehow that felt like the first real step she'd taken forward in years. The grand ballroom of Chicago's Lafayette Hotel hummed with anticipation. Oliver stood in the wings of the stage, watching conference attendees filter in through the ornate double doors. Each face that passed through security triggered a small surge of hope, followed by familiar disappointment. "She's registered," Regina whispered, appearing at his side. Her badge was picked up this morning. Oliver's hand tightened on his speech cards. "Where?" "Staff entrance, 7 a.m. "But, sir," Regina hesitated. "The security footage shows someone else collected it for her. Lydia Harper." Of course. He should have expected nothing less from a woman who'd spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. The question was, would she actually come? Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Charlotte paced her hotel room, her unopened conference badge lying on the bed like an accusation. Through the window she could see Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, its waters dark and choppy under heavy clouds. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Lydia. "Ceremony starts in 20 minutes. Where are you?" Charlotte picked up the badge, running her thumb over the name printed in bold letters. Charlotte Reed. Another identity, another mask. But for how much longer? The hotel room phone rang, making her jump. "Miss Reed, this is hotel security. There's a situation requiring your immediate attention in the service corridor." Charlotte's instincts flared. "What kind of situation?" "One of your shelter residents, Amanda Collins. She's asking for you specifically." Charlotte's heart dropped. Amanda had come to the conference as part of the shelter's success stories panel. If something had happened, "I'll be right there." She grabbed her phone and room key, leaving the conference badge behind. The service corridor was quiet, lit by fluorescent lights that cast strange shadows. "Amanda! Down here!" A voice called from around the corner. Charlotte hurried forward, then stopped dead. The corridor was empty. Behind her, footsteps approached. She turned to see a man in a press badge, phone raised like a weapon. "Charlotte Evans," he said, his smile sharp as a blade. "Or should I say, Rebecca Martinez? That was your name in Boston, wasn't it?" The world tilted sideways. Charlotte backed away, her shoulder blades hitting the wall. "Who are you?" "Wesley Drake, Boston Herald. I've been following your story for quite a while." He held up his phone, showing a grainy photo of a younger Charlotte being led into a police station. "Amazing what you find when you dig deep enough. The assault charges that mysteriously disappeared, the detective who suddenly retired, the sealed records. Those records are sealed for a reason," Charlotte managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Everything's a story waiting to be told." Drake stepped closer. "And yours got a lot more interesting when Oliver Bennett's mystery savior disappeared into thin air. Tell me, does he know about Boston, about the man who ended up in a coma?" Charlotte's fingers found the panic button on her phone, a direct line to shelter security. One press and help would come. But then there would be questions, reports, attention she couldn't afford. "What do you want?" "An exclusive. The whole story. Boston, New York, everything. Give me that. And maybe I don't have to mention Harmony House or the women you're supposedly helping." The threat in his voice made something snap inside Charlotte. She straightened, stepping away from the wall. "You threaten vulnerable women to get your story." "I'm just connecting dots. Mrs. Martinez, or whatever you're calling yourself these days." From somewhere nearby, applause erupted, the conference ceremony beginning. Charlotte thought of Oliver Bennett on stage, probably scanning the crowd for a face he'd only glimpsed once. She thought of Amanda, finally strong enough to tell her story, of all the women at Harmony House who trusted her with their darkest moments. "I print whatever you want about me," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "But if you go near my clients, if you print a single word about them, I'll show you exactly why those Boston records were sealed." Drake's smile faltered. Something in her eyes must have reminded him that desperate people were often the most dangerous. "The story's coming out either way," he warned, backing away. "Better it comes from you than from me." Charlotte waited until his footsteps faded before letting herself shake. Her phone buzzed again. Lydia, wondering where she was. On the other side of the wall, she could hear Oliver Bennett's voice carrying through the ballroom's sound system. "Second chances," he was saying, "come in many forms. Sometimes they're grand gestures, sometimes they're simple acts of kindness." Charlotte closed her eyes, letting his voice wash over her. She could walk away now, disappear again. There were other cities, other shelters, other names she could become. But Drake would tell his version regardless, and this time running wouldn't just cost her, it would cost everyone who'd come to depend on her. Her phone buzzed one final time. Not Lydia now, but Amanda. "Where are you? I can't do this panel without you." Charlotte straightened her shoulders and began walking toward the ballroom's side entrance. Her conference badge was still upstairs, but she didn't need it. She knew exactly who she was, even if the rest of the world was about to find out. Inside the ballroom, Oliver felt a shift in the air. He looked up from his speech just as a side door opened, letting in a shaft of light. A figure stood there for a moment, silhouetted, before slipping into the shadows at the back of the room. But in that brief moment, he knew. The way she moved, the set of her shoulders, some things couldn't be changed by time or new identities. Oliver's voice caught for just a second before he continued his speech. She was here, and this time she wasn't running. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke, rain drumming against the ballroom's high windows, but neither Oliver nor Charlotte noticed. They were too busy orbiting toward each other, like planets that had spent years spinning in separate galaxies, finally drawn back into the same dark, infinite space. The applause following Oliver's speech rolled through the ballroom like thunder. As attendees began moving toward the reception area, he scanned the crowd, searching for that familiar silhouette he'd glimpsed earlier. Regina appeared at his elbow, already anticipating his question. "Back corner, by the service entrance," she murmured. "Security has been instructed not to approach." Oliver nodded, forcing himself to move slowly through the crowd, accepting congratulations and handshakes while keeping his true focus on the shadowed corner. She was still there, half hidden behind a marble column, watching him with an intensity he could feel across the room. Charlotte knew she should leave. Every instinct honed by years of survival screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the spot as Oliver Bennett made his way toward her, his purposeful movement reminding her of incoming tide, unstoppable, inevitable. They locked eyes across the last few feet of space between them. The noise of the conference faded away, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and the echo of heartbeats. "I've imagined this moment 1,000 times," Oliver said softly, closing the distance. "But I never quite knew what I would say." Charlotte's throat tightened. He looked older than she remembered, his hair more silver than grey, new lines etched around his eyes. But those eyes, they held the same intensity she'd seen that night in the diner, when he'd gripped her hand and whispered, "Thank you." "Mr. Bennett," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Oliver," he corrected. "I think saving someone's life earns you the right to use their first name." A flash of cameras from the main reception made Charlotte flinch. Oliver noticed, smoothly positioning himself to block her from view. "There's a private conference room down the hall," he said. "We can talk there. That is, if you're willing." Charlotte glanced toward the exit, then back at him. "I don't know if talking will make anything better." "Maybe not, but 3 years of silence haven't made anything better either, have they?" Before she could respond, Lydia appeared through the crowd, her face tight with worry. "Charlotte, we have a problem. That reporter, Drake, he's here with a photographer. They're asking questions about Boston." Oliver's expression sharpened. "What reporter?" It doesn't matter, Charlotte said quickly. I need to go. I need to... Run, Oliver finished. Like you did that night. His voice softened. Whatever you're running from, whatever happened in Boston, let me help. You can't help. Not with this. Charlotte's hands were shaking now. You don't understand what's at stake. Then help me understand. He gestured toward the conference room. 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Charlotte looked between Oliver and Lydia, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. Through the grand windows, she could see her reflection fractured by raindrops, all the different versions of herself she'd been over the years, overlapping and blurring together. 10 minutes, she agreed finally, but not here. She turned to Lydia. Get Amanda somewhere safe. If Drake tries to approach her or any of our other clients, I'll handle it, Lydia promised. Just be careful. Oliver led the way to a smaller room, tucked away from the main conference area. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the churning lake, while a massive oak table dominated the space. Charlotte remained standing as Oliver closed the door, maintaining the distance between them. You built all of this, she said, gesturing to encompass the conference, the foundation, everything, because of that night. Because of you, he corrected, because a stranger showed me more kindness in 5 minutes than I'd experienced in years of running a global empire. He moved closer, slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. Do you know what I remember most about that night? Charlotte shook her head. Your hands, he said softly. They were shaking while you did CPR, but you didn't stop. You were terrified, but you stayed. Until now, I never understood why someone capable of such courage would disappear without a trace. Sometimes courage looks a lot like desperation, Charlotte whispered. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Regina's voice carried through. Sir, the reporter from the Boston Herald is making a scene in the lobby. He's claiming to have breaking news about the foundation and certain staff members at Harmony House. Charlotte's face went pale. I have to go. No, Oliver's voice was firm. You don't have to run anymore. Whatever this is about, whatever happened in Boston, let me help you fight it. You can't fight shadows, Oliver. You can't fix a past that's better left buried. Watch me try. He pulled out his phone. One call to my legal team. And what? Charlotte's laugh was bitter. They'll make it all go away, like it never happened, like I never... She cut herself off, but not before Oliver saw something dark and painful flash across her face. Like you never what? Charlotte moved to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. That night in the diner, I helped you because it was the right thing to do. Because 5 years earlier, when I needed someone to believe in me, to help me, no one did. She turned back to face him. Don't make me your mission, Oliver. Don't make me your redemption story. Is that what you think this is? He gestured to the conference beyond the doors. Some elaborate scheme to pay off a debt, isn't it? No, he said simply. It's about honoring a moment of grace, about creating something meaningful from a second chance at life. He stepped closer. And maybe, if I'm honest, it's about hoping to find the woman who showed me that even in our darkest moments, we're not alone. Another knock, more urgent this time. Mr. Bennett, the press is asking for a statement. Charlotte closed her eyes, remembering another rainy night, another impossible choice. When she opened them again, something had shifted in her expression. Your legal team, she said quietly. How good are they at unsealing old records? The best. Why? Because if we're going to fight shadows, she took a deep breath, we need to start by bringing them into the light. She pulled out her phone, fingers hovering over the keypad. But first, I need to make a call. There's a detective in Boston who needs to hear my side of the story, the whole story. Finally, Oliver watched her dial, seeing not the scared woman who'd run from his hospital room 3 years ago, but someone stronger, someone ready to stop running and start fighting back. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that quiet room, 2 people who'd been orbiting each other for years finally found themselves on the same path, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead, together. Detective James Morrison's voice crackled through the speakerphone. filling Oliver's private suite at the Lafayette. I always knew this day would come. Rebecca, or Charlotte, I guess it is now. Charlotte sat rigid on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Oliver watched her from his position by the window, while Lydia and Regina occupied adjacent chairs. Outside, the storm had settled into a steady drumbeat against the glass. "The case files," Charlotte said. "You kept them. Every piece of evidence." The detective's sigh carried years of regret, including the security footage that the DA's office claimed was, accidentally, corrupted. "Funny how 20 years on the force taught me to keep backups of everything." Oliver leaned forward. "Detective, I have a team of lawyers standing by. But first, we need to understand exactly what happened that night in Boston." There was a long pause. When Morrison spoke again, his voice was heavy with memory. It was October 12th, 2019. Rebecca, Charlotte, was working late at the Brighton Medical Center, finishing her nursing certification. Charlotte closed her eyes, and Oliver saw her lips moving silently, as if reciting a prayer or reliving a nightmare. "The hospital parking garage was under renovation," Morrison continued. "Security cameras were down for maintenance. Perfect timing for Richard Blackwood, chief of surgery, to corner a young nurse who'd rejected his advances one too many times. He had a knife," Charlotte whispered, opening her eyes. He said no one would believe me anyway, that he'd make sure I never worked in medicine again." Lydia reached over, gripping Charlotte's hand. "The official report stated that Dr. Blackwood was found unconscious, having fallen over the parking garage railing onto a lower level," Morrison said. "But the unofficial story, the one buried under layers of hospital politics and police corruption, was very different." "Tell them," Charlotte said, her voice stronger now. "Tell them everything." Dr. Blackwood had a history of harassment complaints, all quietly settled by the hospital board. That night, he attacked Charlotte with a knife, managed to slash her neck before she fought back. In the struggle, he went over the railing. The fall put him in a coma. Oliver's jaw tightened. "Self-defense, clear and simple." "Should have been," Morrison agreed. But Blackwood's family had connections. Suddenly, evidence went missing, witness statements changed, and the narrative shifted. It wasn't attempted assault anymore. It was a young nurse violently attacking a respected surgeon. "That's why you ran," Lydia realized. Charlotte nodded. "Morrison warned me. Said if I stayed, they'd bury me. Not just legally, but completely. So I disappeared, became someone new, and then you found yourself in a diner in New York," Oliver finished softly, "where another choice between running and staying changed everything." Regina's phone buzzed. She checked it, her expression darkening. "Drake's story is going live in an hour. He's got quotes from Blackwood's family, hospital board members. But he doesn't have this," Morrison interrupted. "I'm sending you files now. Security footage. Original witness statements, documentation of the hospital board's cover-up. I've spent 5 years building this case, waiting for the right moment." Charlotte stood abruptly, pacing the room. "And if this comes out, everything I've built at Harmony House will be stronger for it," Lydia insisted. "Do you know what this will mean to our clients? Seeing that their counselor not only survived abuse but fought back, that she rebuilt her life." Oliver moved to Charlotte's side. "Detective Morrison, my legal team will contact you immediately. In the meantime," he glanced at Regina, "how quickly can we arrange a press conference?" "Here. Now." Charlotte spun to face him. "Are you crazy?" "Drake's going to tell your story either way," Oliver said. "But he's going to twist it, use it to sell papers. Unless we tell it first," Regina finished, already typing on her tablet. "We can have the major networks here in 30 minutes. The conference ballroom is still set up." Charlotte hugged herself, looking smaller suddenly. "I don't know if I can—" "You can," Lydia said firmly. "And you won't be alone." She pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Amanda and the other women from Harmony House. Let's show the world what real strength looks like." Oliver stepped closer to Charlotte, close enough to see the faint scar on her neck. a silvery line that had shaped so many of her choices. 5 years ago, you fought back against someone who tried to destroy you. 3 years ago, you saved my life when everyone else looked away. Today you stop running. Today you stand and fight again. Charlotte looked up at him, and for the first time since their reunion, he saw something spark in her eyes. Not fear, not resignation, but a fierce determination. "Detective Morrison," she said, turning back to the phone. "Those files, how fast can you get them to Chicago?" "Already on their way." "And Rebecca?" "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I couldn't do more back then." "You did enough," Charlotte said softly. "You gave me a chance to start over. Now it's time to finish what started that night." As if in response, the storm outside began to ease, the constant drumming of rain softening to a gentle patter. Charlotte moved to the window, watching the clouds part to reveal glimpses of clear sky. 30 minutes, Regina confirmed, ending a call. "Ian, the networks are on their way. And sir, social media is already buzzing about Drake's promised exposé. We need to move fast." Oliver joined Charlotte at the window. "Are you ready for this?" She turned to face him, and in that moment, he saw every version of her at once: the scared nurse in Boston, the anonymous savior in New York, the dedicated counselor in Chicago. But most of all, he saw someone finally ready to stop hiding. "No," she admitted. But I'm done letting fear write my story." She squared her shoulders. "Let's show Drake what real breaking news looks like." The room burst into action, Regina coordinating with the networks, Lydia rallying the Harmony House community, Morrison's evidence being prepared for release. But Oliver remained still, watching Charlotte as she took out her phone and began to write. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. "Writing my opening statement," she replied, her fingers moving swiftly across the screen. "Starting with 2 simple words I should have said 3 years ago." She showed him the screen, where she'd written, "Thank you." Outside, the last remnants of the storm were clearing, making way for whatever new weather the approaching hour would bring. But inside that hotel suite, something had already changed. The weather of the heart, shifting from darkness into light. The conference ballroom had transformed in the last 30 minutes. Where there had been rows of chairs for the foundation event, there were now cameras, lights, and a forest of microphones at the podium. Journalists filled the space, their murmured conversations creating a low hum of anticipation. In a small preparation room, adjacent to the ballroom, Charlotte stood before a mirror, watching Lydia pin her credential badge to her blazer. The name Charlotte Reed caught the light, and for the first time it didn't feel like an alias. It felt like armor. "Drake's here," Regina announced, entering the room. Front row, looking rather smug. "Not for long," Lydia muttered, straightening Charlotte's collar. "Morrison's evidence arrived. Our tech team is queuing up the security footage now." Charlotte's hand went to her neck, fingers brushing the scar. "How many cameras out there?" "All major networks, plus local affiliates," Regina replied. "Live streaming worldwide." "Hey," Oliver's voice came from the doorway. He'd changed into a fresh suit, but his tie was slightly crooked, a rare imperfection that made him seem more human. 2 minutes. Are you ready?" Charlotte met his eyes in the mirror. "No. Yes. I don't know." She turned to face him. "How do you prepare to tell the world your darkest secrets? You remember why you're doing it?" He crossed the room, stopping just short of touching her. "Not for them, not even for us, but for every person who's ever had to choose between fighting and running." A knock at the door. "They're ready," Regina said softly. Charlotte took a deep breath, then reached up and adjusted Oliver's tie. The simple gesture felt strangely intimate, a quiet moment of normalcy before the storm. "Stay close," she asked. "Always." The ballroom lights were blinding as Charlotte approached the podium, Oliver a steady presence beside her. She saw Drake in the front row, his smirk fading as he noticed the confidence in her stride. Behind him, a group of women from Harmony House had gathered, Amanda among them, their faces radiating support. "Good afternoon," Charlotte began, her voice clear and strong despite her racing heart. "My name is Charlotte Reed, but that's not the name I was born with, nor is it the name I had when I saved Oliver Bennett's life 3 years ago in a New York diner. And it's not the name I had when I fought for my life in a Boston parking garage 5 years ago." The room went completely still. In her peripheral vision, Charlotte saw Drake straighten, his hand reaching for his phone. "Many of you came here today expecting a scandal," she continued, "a dramatic exposé about a woman with a hidden past, and you will get a story, but perhaps not the one you were expecting." She nodded to Regina, who triggered the first slide on the massive screen behind the podium. Hospital security footage began to play, showing a younger Charlotte, then Rebecca Martinez, being cornered by a man in surgical scrubs. On October 12th, 2019, Dr. Richard Blackwood attempted to assault me in the parking garage of Brighton Medical Center. When I fought back, he fell from the second level. The hospital board, protecting their chief of surgery, tried to twist the narrative. They nearly succeeded. More images appeared, police reports, witness statements, hospital board meeting minutes. Charlotte's voice grew stronger with each revelation. "I ran because I had to. I changed my name because I needed to survive. And then, one rainy night in New York, I found myself facing another choice, to help or to hide. I chose to help, not because I was brave, but because I couldn't bear to see someone else suffer, while others looked away." She turned slightly, meeting Oliver's gaze. "I ran that night too, but something unexpected happened. The man whose life I saved didn't just look for me. He built something extraordinary. The Bennett Foundation has helped hundreds of women rebuild their lives. Women like me, women like Amanda Collins, who sits here today, ready to tell her own story of survival." Drake was typing frantically now, his exclusive slipping away with each word. Charlotte addressed him directly. "You came here hoping to destroy me with my past, Mr. Drake. But my past is not a weapon you can use against me. It's the forge that made me who I am. Every name I've had, Rebecca Martinez, Charlotte Evans, Charlotte Reed, they're all part of my story, and I'm done letting others tell it for me." She gripped the podium, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "To every woman who's ever had to run, to hide, to become someone new to survive, I see you. To every person who's ever had to fight back and then face the consequences of choosing to live, I stand with you. And to those who would use our pain, our past, our transformations against us." She looked directly into the nearest camera. "We are not your headlines. We are not your cautionary tales. We are warriors, survivors. And today, we stand in the light." The room erupted, cameras flashed, journalists shouted questions, but Charlotte barely heard them. She felt Oliver's hand on her back, steadying her as she stepped away from the podium. Together, they moved toward the side exit, where Lydia waited with tears in her eyes. "Drake's leaving," Regina reported, watching the reporter hurry toward the main doors, his exclusive in shambles. "And social media is exploding. We stand in the light is already trending." In the relative quiet of the preparation room, Charlotte finally let herself shake. Oliver guided her to a chair, kneeling beside her. "And that," he said softly, "was the bravest thing I've ever seen. I feel like I'm going to throw up," Charlotte admitted with a weak laugh. "Perfectly normal," Lydia assured her, passing over a bottle of water. "But Charlotte, look." She held up her phone, showing a cascade of messages from Harmony House residents past and present, women sharing their own stories of running, hiding, surviving, messages of support, of gratitude, of solidarity. "You did it," Oliver murmured. "You turned his weapon into your shield." Charlotte looked up at him, really looked at him, seeing not just the powerful businessman or the man she'd saved, but someone who had spent 3 years trying to create light from darkness. "We did it," she corrected. "All of us." A new message flashed on Lydia's phone. "Detective Morrison. Hospital board requesting emergency meeting. Blackwood family in panic mode. The truth is out. You're free. Free." The word echoed in Charlotte's mind as she leaned back in her chair, exhausted but unburdened. Through the window, She could see the last rays of sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors, as if the universe itself was celebrating this moment of emergence from shadow into light. "What happens now?" she asked, not sure who she was asking, Oliver, Lydia, or herself. "Now," Oliver smiled, taking her hand. "Now, we build something new, together." And for the first time in 5 years, Charlotte didn't feel the urge to run. She had finally found her way home, not to a place, but to herself, to her truth, to people who would stand with her in both storm and sunshine. The journey wasn't over. There would be more questions, more challenges, more storms to weather, but she would face them standing in the light, surrounded by warriors who understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop running and start telling your truth. Dawn found Charlotte sitting in the hotel's rooftop garden, watching the sun rise over Lake Michigan. The morning newspapers lay scattered around her, their headlines still surreal. Survivor turns tables on attempted exposé. Bennett Foundation counselor reveals truth behind Boston case. Hospital board under investigation. "I thought I'd find you here." Oliver's voice came from behind her. He carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one as he sat beside her on the wooden bench. "You left your room early." "Couldn't sleep," she admitted, accepting the coffee. "You might too many thoughts, too many memories. Good ones or bad ones?" "Both. Neither." She smiled faintly. "Did you know this is the first morning in 5 years I've woken up as myself? Not Rebecca, not Charlotte Evans, not even Charlotte Reed. Just me. All of me." Oliver watched her profile in the growing light. She looked different somehow. Lighter, as if sharing her truth had lifted a physical weight from her shoulders. "Judge at the Boston DA's office called," he said carefully. "They're reopening the case. Morrison's evidence, combined with your testimony. They're talking about charges against the hospital board members who orchestrated the cover-up." Charlotte nodded, unsurprised. "And Blackwood? Still in long-term care. His family's lawyers reached out, wanting to discuss a settlement." "No," the word came quickly, firmly. "I don't want their money. What I want," she paused, gathering her thoughts. "What I want is to make sure no other nurse, no other woman, faces what I faced. The money should go to that." Oliver's smile widened. "Funny you should mention that. Regina's been fielding calls all morning. Hospitals wanting to partner with the foundation to create harassment prevention programs. Women's organizations offering to collaborate on safety initiatives. Even the American Nursing Association wants to work with us. Us, if you're interested." He turned to face her fully. "The foundation needs someone to head up its new survivor advocacy program. Someone who understands both sides of the story, the running and the rebuilding." Charlotte stared into her coffee, watching steam curl into the morning air. "You don't think it's too soon? The press conference was just yesterday. People will always say something," Oliver interrupted gently. "The question is, what do you want to say? What do you want to build?" Before she could answer, the rooftop door opened again. Lydia emerged, followed by Amanda and several other women from Harmony House. "Sorry to interrupt," Lydia said, not looking sorry at all. "But you need to see this." She held out her tablet, showing a social media feed filled with stories. Women sharing their experiences of survival, of starting over, of finding strength. The hashtag #WeStandInTheLight had gone viral, creating a virtual wave of solidarity and support. "This is what you started," Amanda said softly, "not just at Harmony House, but everywhere. People needed to see someone stand up and say, 'This is my story, and I'm not ashamed.'" Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. "I never meant to start a movement." "The best movements start that way," Oliver observed, "with one person choosing truth over fear." Lydia sat down on Charlotte's other side. "Harmony House has received over 100 calls since yesterday. Women seeking help, volunteers offering support, donors wanting to contribute. We need to expand, but more than that, we need to connect with other shelters, create a proper network." "The foundation can help with that," Oliver offered. "The foundation should lead it." Charlotte said suddenly. All eyes turned to her as she stood, moving to the rooftop's edge where the whole city spread out before her. Not just a survivor advocacy program, but a complete overhaul. Connect shelters nationwide, standardize support services, create real paths forward for women who need to start over. She turned back to face them, her expression animated. Think about it. What if we could offer not just physical safety, but real futures, job training, education, legal support, everything I had to figure out alone, and not just in Chicago or New York, but everywhere. Oliver stood, joining her at the railing. It would take significant resources. You have those. It would take someone who truly understands the journey. We have that too. She gestured to the women gathered around them. We have an army of survivors, each with wisdom to share. It would take years to build. Good thing I'm done running then. She met his gaze steadily. Unless you've got somewhere else to be. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. Nowhere else in the world. The sun had fully risen now, painting the city in shades of gold and promise. Below them, Chicago was waking up, streets filling with people starting their days. How many of them, Charlotte wondered, were carrying stories like hers? How many needed to know they weren't alone? There's something else you should see, Lydia said, breaking the moment. She handed over her phone, showing an email from Detective Morrison. The Boston Police Department wants to create a special unit for handling cases like yours. Medical workplace violence, institutional cover-ups. They're asking for your input on training protocols. Charlotte read the email, remembering the scared young nurse she'd been, the detective who'd helped her escape, the long road that had led her here. Everything had changed, yet somehow everything had led exactly where it needed to go. You know, she said thoughtfully, for years I thought saving your life was the thing that complicated everything. She looked at Oliver. But maybe it was actually the universe's way of simplifying things, of bringing me exactly where I needed to be, to finally stop running and start building. So, Oliver squeezed her hand. Oh, where do we start? Charlotte looked around at the small group gathered on the rooftop. Lydia with her unwavering support, Amanda with her newly found strength, the other women from Harmony House with their stories yet to be fully told. Then back to Oliver, who had spent 3 years building something beautiful out of a simple act of kindness. We start, she said firmly, by standing in the light, and then we help others find their way here too. The morning breeze carried the promise of change, of purpose, of possibility. Charlotte breathed it in deeply, finally ready to write the next chapter of her story, not alone this time, but surrounded by fellow warriors who understood that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in running from the past, but in using it to build a better future. The Boston DA's office has filed charges against 3 former hospital board members, Oliver announced, entering Charlotte's new office at the Bennett Foundation's Chicago headquarters. Conspiracy, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, the whole list. Charlotte looked up from her laptop, where she'd been reviewing proposals for the Foundation's expanded shelter network. 6 weeks had passed since the press conference, and her office still felt surreal. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the city she'd once hidden in, and a small plaque on her desk reading, Charlotte Martinez Reed, Executive Director of Survivor Advocacy. How are you feeling about it? Oliver asked, settling into one of the chairs across from her desk. Honestly, she leaned back, considering. I thought hearing about the charges would feel more triumphant. Instead, it just feels like closing a book I finished reading long ago. And Blackwood's family. Their lawyers called again about the settlement. She gestured to a folder on her desk. I had our legal team draft a response. Any compensation they offer goes directly to a new scholarship fund for nurses who've survived workplace violence or harassment. Oliver smiled, recognizing the poetry in her solution. Speaking of new beginnings, how was Amanda's first day? Already making waves. Charlotte's expression softened with pride. She's reorganizing our intake procedures, making them more trauma-informed. says no survivor should feel like they're being interrogated when they're seeking help. The intercom buzzed. Ms. Martinez-Reed. The video conference with the National Shelter Network is starting in 5 minutes. Thank you, Claire. Charlotte stood, gathering her materials. Are you sitting in on this one? Wouldn't miss it. Oliver fell into step beside her as they headed to the conference room. Although I suspect they're more interested in hearing from you than the guy who just writes the checks. Charlotte elbowed him playfully. You do more than that, and you know it. Her expression grew more serious. Although speaking of doing more, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. Before she could continue, they reached the conference room. The large screen was already active, showing faces from shelters across the country, directors, counselors, and advocates eager to be part of their expanding network. Good morning, everyone, Charlotte began, her voice clear and confident. Today, we're discussing the standardization of our survivor support services. But first, I want to share a story about why this matters. She glanced at Oliver, who nodded encouragingly. 5 years ago, I ran from Boston with nothing but fear and determination. I found help through scattered resources, lucky breaks, and the occasional kindness of strangers. Today, we have the opportunity to create something better, a coordinated network that ensures no survivor has to rely on luck to rebuild their life. The presentation flowed smoothly, with shelter directors offering insights and Charlotte weaving their experiences into a coherent vision. Oliver watched her with quiet admiration, seeing how naturally she'd stepped into this role of leader and advocate. After the meeting, they walked together to the building's rooftop garden, a space Oliver had added after noticing how much Charlotte loved the hotel garden during the conference. The late autumn air was crisp, but the sun was warm on their faces. You wanted to discuss something, Oliver prompted, noticing how Charlotte seemed both nervous and determined. Yes, she took a deep breath. I've been thinking about the Foundation's next phase, about how to reach people who might not come to shelters or counseling centers. Go on. I want to start a speakers bureau, train survivors who are ready to share their stories, send them to hospitals, police academies, nursing schools. Show people on the front lines what these situations really look like, how to recognize the signs, how to help. Oliver nodded slowly. And you want to be one of the speakers? I want to be the first speaker. She turned to face him fully. Starting with Boston Medical Center. The weight of her words hung in the air between them. Oliver studied her face, seeing not just determination but a deep sense of purpose. Are you sure? Going back there? I need to. She moved to the rooftop's edge, looking out over the city. Not for them, not even for closure, but for the Rebecca Martinez, who felt so alone that night, for every other person who might feel that same loneliness. Oliver joined her at the railing, their shoulders touching. When would you want to start? That's the complicated part. She turned to face him. I'd need to be in Boston for at least a month, setting up the program, working with the hospitals, training the first group of speakers. She hesitated. And I don't want to go alone. The last words came out barely above a whisper, but they seemed to fill the entire rooftop. Oliver felt his heart skip a beat as he understood what she was really saying. Charlotte, he began, but she rushed on. I know it's asking a lot. You have the foundation to run, and we've only just, whatever this is between us, it's still new. But every time I imagine going back there, facing those halls and memories, the only way it feels possible is if you're... Oliver silenced her with a kiss, their first, soft and sure and full of promise. When they parted, Charlotte blinked in surprise, then smiled. Is that a yes? I've been trying to figure out how to tell you I love you for weeks now, and you beat me to it with a business proposal. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. Of course I'll go to Boston with you. I'd go anywhere with you. Charlotte's laugh was watery. I had this whole presentation prepared. Logistics, timelines, budgets. Save it for the board. He pulled her closer. Although I do have one condition. What's that? When we're in Boston... He touched the small scar on her neck gently. I want to take you to dinner at this little Italian place I know. The same restaurant where, 3 years ago, I was headed the night my heart decided to stop in a diner instead. Charlotte's eyes widened as she understood. You believe in fate, Mr. Bennett? I believe in second chances. He smiled. And third chances and fourth chances, and however many it takes to get it right. The sun was setting now, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and promise. Below them, the city buzzed with life, thousands of stories unfolding, some just beginning, others being rewritten. So, Charlotte said softly, Boston, Boston, Oliver agreed. But first, he pulled back slightly, his expression growing serious. I believe you mentioned something about a presentation with logistics and timelines. Charlotte laughed, the sound carrying across the rooftop garden. Always the businessman. Always the man who fell in love with a warrior who turns her pain into purpose. He squeezed her hand. Now, show me how we're going to change the world. Together, they walked back inside, leaving the sunset behind but carrying its warmth with them. They had bridges to build, between past and future, between trauma and healing, between two hearts that had found each other in the most unlikely of places. And somewhere in Boston, a hospital corridor waited to be transformed from a place of shadows into a beacon of hope, one story at a time. Boston Medical Center's auditorium was packed to capacity. Doctors, nurses, administrators, and students filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Through the small window in the preparation room, Charlotte could see Detective Morrison sitting in the front row beside Oliver and Lydia, who had flown in from Chicago for this moment. 5 minutes, Ms. Martinez-Reed, a staff member called softly. Charlotte nodded, turning back to the mirror. She looked different than she had 6 months ago, stronger, calmer, more herself. The woman who stared back at her wore a deep blue blazer, a small silver pendant at her throat, deliberately drawing attention to the scar she no longer tried to hide. I thought I might find you here, a familiar voice said from the doorway. Amanda, now the Foundation's training coordinator, stepped into the room. Although I didn't expect you to be so calm. Surprisingly, I am. Charlotte smiled at her friend's reflection. Maybe because this feels right. Like everything that happened led to this exact moment. Amanda moved closer, adjusting Charlotte's badge. The name Charlotte Martinez-Reed caught the light, each part of her identity now proudly displayed. The first group of speaker advocates is ready. 20 survivors trained and ready to share their stories across the country. 20 warriors, Charlotte corrected gently, ready to turn their pain into purpose. A soft knock preceded Oliver's entrance. They're ready for you. He paused, taking in her appearance. You look terrified, nauseous. Perfect. He crossed the room, taking her hands in his. But if you want to run, I know a great little diner in New York. Charlotte laughed, the tension breaking. No more running. She squeezed his hands. Although I wouldn't mind having dinner at that Italian place you promised. After all this, it's a date. He kissed her softly, then stepped back. Go change the world, my love. The walk to the auditorium podium felt like traversing years. Charlotte passed the emergency department where she'd once worked, the corridors she'd fled through, the spot where everything had changed. But this time, each step carried her forward, not away. The audience fell silent as she took her place at the podium. In the front row, Oliver nodded encouragingly, while Morrison touched his tie, a gesture that spoke of pride and vindication. Good morning, Charlotte began, her voice clear and strong. Many of you know me as the former nurse who made headlines 6 months ago. Some of you knew me as Rebecca Martinez, the nursing student who disappeared 5 years ago. Today, I stand before you as Charlotte Martinez-Reed, and I'm here to tell you a story about choices. She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room. It's a story about the choice between running and staying, between hiding and helping, between letting our past define us and using it to redefine the future. The next hour passed in a blur of powerful moments. Charlotte shared her story, all of it, from the attack in the parking garage to that rainy night in New York, from building a new life in Chicago to finally reclaiming her truth. She spoke about the Bennett Foundation's new initiative, training survivor advocates to work with medical staff and law enforcement. Change, she concluded, doesn't come from grand gestures alone. It comes from small choices made in crucial moments, from a detective choosing to keep evidence, from a scared nurse choosing to perform CPR, from survivors choosing to stand in the light and say, "This is my story, and it matters." The standing ovation that followed felt less like applause and more like a wave of healing washing through the room. As Charlotte stepped down from the podium, she found herself surrounded by people, nurses sharing their own stories, administrators pledging support, students asking how they could help. Hours later, after the last hand had been shaken and the last question answered, Charlotte found herself in an unlikely place, the hospital parking garage. Oliver stood beside her, their fingers intertwined, as she faced the spot where everything had changed. "Ready to go?" he asked softly. "Almost." She reached into her bag, pulling out a small envelope. Inside was her old nursing badge, Rebecca Martinez, RN student. With deliberate care, she placed it on the concrete barrier. "Goodbye, Rebecca," she whispered. "Thank you for being strong enough to run when you had to, and for saving someone special on your way to becoming me." They walked to Oliver's car, where Lydia and Amanda waited to take them to dinner. The setting sun painted the Boston skyline in familiar shades of gold and promise, the same colors she'd seen that first morning on the Chicago hotel rooftop when she'd chosen to stop running. "You know," Oliver said, as they drove through the city, "I never did properly thank you for saving my life that night." Charlotte smiled, touching the engagement ring that now sat on her finger. A recent addition he'd given her last week, presented not with grand gestures, but with quiet certainty over morning coffee. "I think you did better than thank me. You helped me save myself." At the restaurant, a cozy Italian place tucked away on a quiet street, their small group celebrated not just the day's success, but the journey that had brought them here. They toasted to new beginnings, to chosen family, to the power of truth and the strength of second chances. Later that night, as Charlotte and Oliver walked back to their hotel, a light rain began to fall. But this time, instead of running for cover, Charlotte tilted her face to the sky, letting the drops fall where they would. "What are you thinking?" Oliver asked, watching her with love. "I'm thinking about storms," she said thoughtfully, "about how sometimes the things we think will destroy us actually clear the path for something beautiful." He pulled her close, both of them getting slowly soaked, but neither caring. "Adum, and what beautiful thing comes next?" Charlotte thought about the Foundation's expanding work, about the survivor advocates ready to share their stories, about the life she and Oliver were building together. She thought about all the people still hiding in shadows, waiting for someone to show them it was safe to step into the light. "Everything," she answered simply. "Everything comes next." As they walked through the gentle rain, Charlotte felt the last pieces of her story settling into place. She had spent years running from her past, only to find that sometimes the longest journey leads right back to where it began. Not to change what happened, but to transform it into something powerful, something healing, something true. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. Not just standing in the light, but becoming it, bright enough to guide others home. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.